Let's explore whether breath counting is meditation. This morning's lesson is drawn from a good-hearted question found on Reddit. Is it time for me to move on from counting breaths? The individual wrote, I have been meditating by counting breaths for several months now, with the understanding that this is a good beginner practice. To hone your powers of concentration before more serious forms of inquiry, affirmations, observing breath, mantras, etc. can begin. I have been and still am enjoying it. I like having a clear object that lets me know when I have lost focus. I've reached a point where more often than not I can get through my 20-minute session without losing count. I still have thoughts, of course, but rarely are they strong or long enough to drag me away from the counting. Here's my question. Is now a good time to progress to a more advanced form of meditation, like simply observing the breath without counting? Or am I wrong to think of counting the breath as a training exercise in the first place? Is counting breaths in and of itself sufficient to deliver deep spiritual insights and clarity? So I wish to thank the person for asking this good question, and I wish to approach it first with broad brushstrokes, then fine details. And for some strange reason, I really feel a good place to begin here is with the yin and yang of it all. About 100 years before the birth of the Buddha, legend tells us that Lao Tzu of China composed the 81 poems of the Tao Te Ching. In it, we learn of the attributes of yang and yin, and oddly enough, to always choose yin instead of yang. Bearing that in mind, these observations of Lao Tzu are not unique to China. They are not unique to Taoism. Wherever there are humans, there are these different sets of characteristics. And so it comes as a little surprise that in Iron Age India, we begin to explore these attributes of yang or patriarchy through the character study of the Buddha's wicked cousin, Devadatta, who thought it would be a splendid idea to be rigid, fearful, superstitious, controlling, elitist, cryptic, competitive, and cruel. Let's contrast that with Yin's matriarchy as typified by the Buddha, who is also known as Gautama, who strove to be flexible, loving, rational, laid back, egalitarian, lucid, cooperative, and kind. So let's simplify this and reduce it from 8 elements just to 3. 3 elements of being rigid and controlling and elitist. So concentration is an act of rigidity. Saying I'm only going to watch this and everything else can just fuck all the way off. That's being rigid. That's being controlling. Saying that before you can practice those techniques, you have to practice this technique is a little bit elitist, but saying that you can't practice any of the Buddha's techniques until you practice breath counting that the Buddha never taught, well, that is very elitist. Now, I'm not attacking you. I'm not a troll. I'm try not to act like a school of prana and gobble you up. If you come to believe this, it's because of the books you've been exposed to, or the teachers you've been exposed to, or common social preconceptions you've been exposed to. It's not your fault. And I have no desire to beat you up, make you feel bad. So let's replace rigidity with flexibility. Let's replace our controlling tendencies with being laid back. Let's replace elitism with egalitarianism. Let us practice the Buddha's teachings and share them with others without putting up roadblocks for other people. And by the way, this is a universal problem. Elitism is found in every gender, in every ethnicity, on every populated continent. It's found spiritually, religiously, secularly. It's found vocationally, recreationally. It's a universal phenomena. Not a very good one, but a universal one. So I think the most efficient way to dispel confusion at this point is to explore mindfulness and meditation through the lens of neuroscience. Remember, the Buddha is said to have walked the earth during the Iron Age, and they didn't have fMRIs. They didn't have functional magnetic resonance imaging machines back then, so things could get confused pretty quick. Additionally, let's go back to yin and yang for a moment. People who are stuck in yang, people who are stuck in the tradition of Devadatta are power hungry and prestige hungry, and they're more concerned about ascending and clawing the way into positions of power and prestige than actually mastering the teachings. When we look at the life story, the legend of Devadatta, he spent all his time and energy undermining the Buddha, dividing the assembly of students, until finally he had his own group of patrons, his own group of students that he had taken away from the Buddha, and he began teaching. But he was a terrible teacher, and the stuff he taught did not work. They did not bring peace. And so after all his time and effort striving to take away from the Buddha and build up his own practice, it crumbled because he was not a master of meditation. He was a master of politics and propaganda, which is completely different. Whether it's in politics, whether it's in spirituality, those most worthy of leadership are seldom those who are the most hungry for it. They're the most peaceful and laid back and thoughtful people. These are not mudslingers. These are not people who will climb into the mud pit and wrestle with you. And so it is in Buddhism that the loudest teachers are simply the least competent teachers, which is why there's so much confusion. The Buddha made it very simple. He taught, and I paraphrase, that the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. The proof of a teacher's worthiness is not in his peer approval or his or her beauty or his or her wealth, but in simply the effectiveness of the teachings. Go to a teacher, receive instruction, apply the instruction for about 5 minutes or so, every 12 hours or so, for 7 consecutive days. Caveat, if you can't do a simple exercise intermittently, once a day for 7 consecutive days, then the biggest problem is not the teacher. But let's assume you do it. Let's assume you learn a technique and you practice it for about 5 minutes every 12 hours or so. At the conclusion of 7 days, notice your results. Are you more peaceful? Are you more joyful? Are you more loving? Are you more resourceful? If not, then find a better technique. Find a better teacher. If you are, then mazel tov. Stick with this guy or this gal for as long as they serve you on the path. Be ruthless on the path. Your loyalty is not to the teacher. Your loyalty is not to an idea. Your loyalty is to your personal evolution and your effect on the world around you. So, how's about this whole neuroscience thing? Boy, it's really dusty over here, isn't it? I guess you can't tell, but it sure is in my neck of the woods. Yikes. So since we're exploring mindfulness meditation through the lens of neuroscience, I've got 3 illustrations of the brain for you to share, to accost you with about your head and shoulders. So we'll begin with the first thing. Concentration is not mindfulness. When we actively concentrate, when we actively analyze, we rely upon portions of our brain, such as the medial or the dorsolateral regions of our prefrontal cortex, just behind our forehead. Over-reliance on our prefrontal cortex. The more we rely on our prefrontal cortex, the more our amygdala lights up. Located in the dungeon of our limbic system, the amygdala functions as the seat of both aggression and anxiety. Pretty much phenomena that are the opposite of what we want from meditation, ironically enough. But here's some good news. When we cease to rely upon the active concentration and analysis of our prefrontal cortex, and instead rely upon the mindfulness latent within our sympathetic nervous system and the meditation latent within our parasympathetic nervous system, our blood mass shifts from the amygdala to this thing that kind of looks like a catcher's mitt. This thing that the cool kids refer to as the anterior cingulate gyrus. This thing that functions as the hub of our mirror neurons, the seat of empathy and compassion and love. Well, that's Jim Dandy. Now that we've seen that there's a difference between relying on a prefrontal cortex or relying on our autonomic nervous system, let's take a deeper dive. We'll begin with mindfulness. Every time we inhale, whether we mean to or not, whether we intend to or not, whether we feel it or not, we are accessing our sympathetic nervous system. Now this sympathetic nervous system is not found in the fancy part of the brain. Instead, it is ensconced in the thoracic or ribcage region of the spinal cord. No, it has not evolved to support either extreme of mind blanking or active concentration. What then has the sympathetic nervous system evolved to do? It's evolved to notice, and to do so vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly. That's right, it is as if, when seated in meditation, we are not the playwright, nor the director, nor the thespian, nor the producer. We're just a member of the audience, watching the show. And quite a show it is, for we are wired to notice sights, sounds, sensations, flavors, scents, and the like, and to notice it vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly. But that's not all. We are also wired to notice emotions, intentions, thoughts, memories, and imaginings. Once again, vulnerably, passively, viscerally, and randomly. That's just a thumbnail sketch. That the vast field of perception encompasses all possible dualities, from the external to the internal, from the physical to the mental, from the pleasurable to the painful, from the interesting to the boring, from the glorious to the grotesque. Now, that could inspire the legitimate question, what are we to do with that which we notice? Fortunately, evolution took care of that for us. For every time we exhale, we meditate. Every time we exhale, whether we know it or not, whether we feel it or not, we are accessing our parasympathetic nervous system, ensconced within both the lower lumbar region of our spinal cord, as well as the tippy top of our cervical region, also known as the brainstem. This parasympathetic nervous system is evolved to support both physical relaxation as well as mental release. And remember, this is all passive. This is all automatic. And so you might ask, and rightfully so, if this is automatic, why aren't I already the Baron of Bliss? Why aren't I the Sultan of Samadhi? Why aren't I, already enlightened? And the answer is kind of humorous. Because of Urkel. Our brain is like Urkel. Urkel was sweet and enthusiastic and intelligent, but a trifle ungainly, a trifle spazzy. But here's the funny thing. Here's the ironic thing. If a cast member of family members pulled Urkel aside and said, Urkel, I need your help with something, Urkel would be there in a heartbeat. Heart of gold. Our brain's like that. If we ask our brain to silently and mentally recite the demonstrative pronoun this during each inhalation, it'll begin to cooperate with our sympathetic nervous system and will perform the perception that is also known as mindfulness. Similarly, if during our exhalation we ask our brain to silently and mentally recite the one-syllable verb ease, it'll begin to cooperate with our parasympathetic nervous system. And we'll be practicing the release that is also known as meditation. Now, let's talk about a gradual path. A gradual path is not a prerequisite. You don't need to collect hundreds and thousands of bows and mantras and offerings or the like. But for those of us not raised in Iron Age India, we might not be used to sitting. And so here's what I recommend doing. Your first week, every 12 hours or so, sit for 5 minutes. Your legs don't have to be in a pretzel. It works better if your shins are just parallel to each other. Remembering not that our knees are only hinge joints, and therefore we turn out from our hips. But we don't force the turnout. We let gravity do the work for us. We just sit there. And we practice the techniques I just mentioned to you. And it's, you can come to a live stream and it's live every 12 hours. If you can't make it, that's fine. YouTube's really good about saving my live streams. But show up every 12 hours to practice. By your second week, if you may feel ready to bump that up to 10 minutes. By the third week, you may be ready to bump that up to 15 minutes. Listen to your body. Await what I like to call divine impatience. Eventually, by the conclusion of the 15th week, you could be utterly comfortable with sitting for a 15-minute lesson in a 60-minute class. By that point, you could have so mastered the Buddha's Eightfold Path that you practice it spontaneously, habitually, easily, and effectively. This is the path. Mindfulness and meditation are the 7th and 8th folds of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. And they are the dynamo that turns the gears and pistons of the metaphoric enlightenment machine. They are that which drive the effortless effort of being in the zone or the flow state. They are those which make it neurologically possible to practice the highest love, which is spontaneous and uncontrived. Simply sitting in meditation and cooperating with the mechanisms of our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, which are simply unlocked with the key of inhalation and exhalation, we can't help but notice change. Sometimes subtle, sometimes jarring, sometimes pleasurable, sometimes painful. We cannot help but notice change. Change in appearances, sounds, sensations, flavors, scents, and the like. Change in our emotions, intentions, thoughts, memories, and imaginings. Some change pleasurable, some painful, some glorious, some mortifying, some quick, some glacial. We are already wired to notice the four bases of mindfulness: the mental, the interpersonal, the physical, and the circumstantial. And so involuntarily we will experience the mental morality of wishing others well, the verbal morality of communicating in a kind manner to each other, a manner that is informed by the centered spontaneity that is the fringe benefit of mindfulness and meditation. We will not be able to help but practice the non-violence of behavioral morality. We won't be able to help ourselves but practice the circumstantial morality that loses its taste for competition and cruelty and instead longs to kindly cooperate. The Buddha's path is easy and quick and virtually effortless when done correctly. I do look forward to practicing it with you after approximately 30 seconds of housekeeping. Wrong button. Remember that wonderful line from Emperor's New Groove? Wrong lever! This is Lama Jigme Gyatso of the Buddha Joy Meditation School. For more than 30 years, I spent about 8 hours a day, almost every day, studying, practicing, mastering, and reverse engineering the teachings and techniques of each sect of Buddhism and Hinduism and Taoism and Judaism and Christianity, so that you would not have to. Welcome, my friends, to Meditate Like a Jedi, which is made possible due to the generosity of viewers just like you. Let us return to the latest iteration of Love and Letting Go. I would love to tell you that it is Buddha Cat approved, but there is no such beastie. We're going to circuit through 4 super easy, simple exercises. Beware of elitism. As the Buddha lay dying, it is said that he explained, I have taught lo these many years, with an outstretched arm and an open hand, keeping no secrets. Beware of those who tell you that there are secrets and you're not worthy of them. If you listen quietly, you can hear the Buddha face-palming from wherever he's at right now. Just as a runner will often limber up before sprinting, we can play with some gentle, passive, easy contemplations, also to help us limber up, so that our reaction to whatever we experience, whatever we perceive, emote, intend, reason, recall, and imagine, is mellow. so that we won't run in circles, scream and shout needlessly. Therefore, let us begin by bringing the 4 bases of mindfulness into the path of impermanence. Intermittently, you're going to see Pali words in parentheses. They aren't important, but there are some people who are impressed with them. They think it means that I know what I'm talking about. It doesn't. There are lots of idiots who are bilingual or multilingual. It's just a fun thing. Please chant with me. Observing the coming and going of circumstantial phenomena, help us to see that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. During our inhalation, we can silently and mentally recite the monosyllabic synonym for circumstance. During the exhalation, we can silently and mentally recite the metaphor for change. It's not our job to visualize or believe or emote or anything like that. We're just playing with words silently and mentally and passively. Let's play with this exercise for 4 rounds, assuming a round is simply 1 inhalation followed by 1 exhalation. And let's count those 4 rounds on our left hand. During our in-breath, let's advance the tip of our left thumb and allow it to come to rest upon our left little finger, counting the first set of creases, the second set of creases, the third set of creases, and the tip, while silently and mentally we recite, lots melt. This is not synchronized water ballet. It's okay if you're a little bit faster or a little bit slower than me. That's fine. I promise I'm not going to dispatch minions to pelt you with bananas. Much. Hardly at all. Not so that you'd notice. Together. Observing the coming and going of physical phenomena, help us to feel that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. Let's use the noun forms as a metaphor of the physical. As a metaphor of, as a synonym for bodies. Observing the coming and going of interpersonal phenomena, help us to hear that helps us to hear that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. So we're using feels as a synonym for our experience of the interpersonal. Let's count upon our middle finger. Observing the coming and going of mental phenomena helps us to clearly perceive that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. Thank you for your patience. Come, let us count upon our left index finger. Even though I've held my hand up in front of the camera, I invite you to join me in resting your palms in your lap, for to do so is most ergonomic. There we go. This is a much better photograph of holding your hands in your lap. The moment you have a specific question about Buddhist chanting, Buddhist meditation, Buddhist philosophy, or their application, please type your question in great detail in the chat window. Let us conclude our first lap of mental training by bringing the 4 bases of mindfulness into the path of loving kindness. Wow, that was weird. Wasn't 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Wow, that was super weird. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Please chant with me. Since we are not alone in our mental frustrations, we could also long that others' mental needs also be met. And so it is as if we were using words to gently guide our intention. And it is as if in the phantasmagoria of our imagination, we were ladling out lentils for a lunch guest. Only instead of lentils, it's wisdom, and instead of a ladle, it's just words. So let us wish great wisdom for all minds of all beings. Together. Since we are not alone in our interpersonal frustrations, we could also long that others' interpersonal needs also be met. Since we are not alone in our physical frustrations, we could also long that others' physical needs also be met. Since we are not alone in our circumstantial frustrations, we could also long that other circumstantial needs also be met. We're using the word boon as a one-syllable synonym for circumstantial good fortune. Having climbed to contemplative And so we begin our second series, beginning again with impermanence. Overcoming it. I'm sorry, let's try this again. Observing the coming and going of circumstantial phenomena helps us to see that ever-changing one and all, there is nothing permanent. There is nothing to... Well, sorry about this. Helps us to see that ever-changing one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. And so we've already learned how to count upon the left fingers and thumb 16 rounds of breath. On our right hand, we can count sets. The first set is the contemplation of impermanence. The next 14 sets are simply awareness and letting go. And the 16th set is the contemplation of loving kindness. So I call this a circuit. And I think it feels kind of fun that there's a circuit, it's a complete system, and that way it doesn't feel like we're going to get stuck sitting here in our heads forever. There's a circuit, and it's kind of nice. Observing the coming and going of circumstantial phenomena, help us to see that ever-changing one. Helps us to see that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. Observing the coming and going of physical phenomena helps us to feel that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. Observing the coming and going of interpersonal phenomena helps us to hear that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. Observing the coming and going of mental phenomena helps us to clearly perceive that ever-changing one and all there is nothing permanent to grasp. Let us bring whatever we spontaneously notice into the path of awareness and letting go. I'd like to take a moment to dispel a myth, if I may. There is a myth that there are deep insights to be sought, and that when we are fully enlightened, we will have no thoughts and no emotions other than bliss and peace. But that is not the case. Enlightenment is not the depression of mental phenomena. It's not the depression of our mental faculties. In fact, there can be no enlightenment without accessing our mental faculties. Enlightenment is simply mastery of the Eightfold Path. Getting so good at this this Eightfold Path of the Buddha that we practice it spontaneously, habitually, easily, and effectively. As a small child, I found the task of tying my shoes to be daunting. With much effort and repetition and repeated instruction, I got so good at tying my shoes that by the time the first grade rolled around, I was able to tie my shoes spontaneously, habitually, easily, and effectively. The same thing can be said about flossing one's teeth or riding a bicycle. The Buddha's path is easier than we've been led to believe. We are allowed to perceive, emote, intend, reason, recall, and imagine the full spectrum of phenomena. Let us bring the 4 bases of mindfulness into the path of metta loving kindness. Since we are not alone in our chitta, mental dukkha, frustrations, we could also metta alone. That others' chitta, mental needs also be met. Since we are not alone in our Vedana interpersonal dukkha frustrations, we could also metta alone. That others' Vedana interpersonal needs also be met. Since we are not alone in our kaya physical dukkha frustrations, we could also metta alone. That others' kaya physical needs also be met. Since we are not alone in our Lama circumstantial dukkha frustrations, we could also metta alone. Let others' Dhamma circumstantial needs also be met. Now, as we begin our third circuit, let us bring the Satipatthana 4 bases of mindfulness into the path of anicca impermanence. Observing the coming and the anicca going of Dhamma circumstantial phenomena. Helps us to see that ever-changing manner, no, there is nothing permanent to anatta grasp. Whoops. Observing the coming and the Nika going of Kaya physical phenomena helps us to feel that ever-changing one and all. There is nothing permanent to one not grasp. Observing the coming and the Nika going of Vedana interpersonal phenomena helps us to hear that ever-changing one and all. There is nothing permanent to one not grasp. Observing the coming and the Nika going of Chitta mental phenomena helps us to clearly perceive that ever-changing one and all. There is nothing permanent to one not grasp. And let us bring whatever we spontaneously notice into the path of awareness and letting go. Let's seal our practice by percussively chanting loving wishes for universal enlightenment and well-being. May all minds clear and permanent be as enlightened as a Buddha's mind. May all relationships resounding yet impermanent be as loving as a Buddha's speech. May all bodies sensual yet impermanent be as beautifully happy as a real or imagined deva's form. May all circumstances appearing yet impermanent be as safe and abundant as a real or imagined Devi's land. If you feel that I have earned it, you could give this live stream a thumbs up. You could even help support this channel. In approximately 10¼ hours, I would very much like to return to lead today's evening meditation class and group practice. And if you are as geeky as me, may the Force be with you always.